So I want to go back to the book of 1 Samuel tonight. We've taken a pretty good break from it. And I want to look at chapter 9. We're actually going to cover more than usual, probably through chapter 11. I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to paraphrase some and summarize some. And I want to get the main idea of what's going on here. You remember that when we left off, Israel is expecting a king. They've asked for one. They want a king like the nations. The thing is that God had already told them, when this happens, you have to wait for me. I'm going to give you the answer. And so they're all looking at Samuel. Samuel's the one in charge. He's the prophet. He's their judge. Kind of like, just like Gideon and Samson and all those others have been. So they're looking to Samuel. And Samuel doesn't have any more information really than that. He just knows that God's going to do it. So he's looking to God. Okay, God, what are you going to tell me? When are you going to tell me? And the theme of this message tonight, the thing I want you to see throughout all of this is, if you just put it in a simple, just one word, it would be election. And election, when you try to define it in its most simple definition, is that God does what he wants and it's good. That's basically what election is. God does what he wants and it's good. We're going to see this played out. But it's not just here. This is something that sometimes people, they get these doctrines. They get called the doctrines of grace or whatever. They think, well, these points are the finer points of theology. And maybe, we want to just stay close to John 3:16 and we don't want to worry about everything else. But I don't think you can understand John 3:16 or any other scripture unless you understand, well, election is one. You cannot understand, you cannot process the doctrine of salvation, the nature and state of man, the holiness of God. You can't understand any of that stuff if you don't understand election. In fact, I would say if you don't understand God at first, which is the main point of all creation and theology, he's at the center of all that. If you don't understand him, then you're going to have a hard time with election. But if you understand who God is, or at least as best a man can understand based on what's been told, well, election's really not hard to understand. It's not hard to accept. I mean, Isaiah has a couple of passages that just make it pretty plain and simple to understand that even people who have a hard time with election can hear these and go, yeah, I understand that. For instance, Isaiah 14:26. He says, "This is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth. And this is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations, for the Lord of hosts has purposed." In other words, he's saying, here's my plan. Here's what I'm going to do. And here's what I want you to understand about it. I'm the one who's decided to make it happen. The Lord of hosts has purposed this. He has designed this. He has planned this. And who will annul it? Find someone. Who do you think, if God says, this is what I'm going to do, who is it that can stop him from doing it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? If he reaches out to do something, who's going to be the one to push his hand away and say, no, you can't do that? Same book, Isaiah 46:9. He says, I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. Now I want you to think about what he means there. He doesn't just say, I can declare the end from the beginning because I know everything that's going to happen. That's not what he says, is it? He does not say, I can declare the end from the beginning, from ancient times, the things that haven't yet passed, because, well, I already know what's going to happen. What does he say instead? He says, I can declare the end from the beginning because my purpose stands. I can tell you what's going to happen at the end of time, not just because I've seen it and know. I mean, that could be a prophecy, right? I mean, there are men who have had dreams or visions or things explained to them and were able to tell other people what would happen, but it wasn't because they sat down and planned it out. God says, I know the end from the beginning because I'm the one who said that's what's going to happen. And who's going to turn back my hand? He knew what Saul was going to experience. He knew the things that would happen with Saul. He knew that Saul was going to be the king, not because he could just tell into the future and understand those things, but because it was by his own design that it would happen. And no one could fix that. No one could change that. No one could annul that. It's not just with Saul, and it's not just in Isaiah. Do you think, speaking of election being like this finer point of theology, do you think that election was a finer point of Abraham's theology? I mean, here's Abraham. He lives in this land where his fathers, it's been a family tradition to worship the gods beyond the river. And God comes to him one day. Somehow, he calls him out. He says, leave. I've chosen you to leave this place. I'm going to reveal myself to you. I'm going to make promises to you, and I'm going to make things happen to you. Do you think that being singled out by God in that way was, some finer point of theology that maybe someday if my kids ever go to a seminary, they can learn more about it? Or do you think that was the whole point of him leaving that place and trusting God and living as a stranger in a strange land? That was kind of the core of it, wasn't it? God chose me. God told me that He wanted me to do these things. He'd selected me to do these things. Same thing can be said of Isaac and Jacob. What about Job's experiences? I mean, all that stuff that Job went through, all the times that he complained, it was always something along the lines of, God doesn't really have the right to do this to me. And when God comes to him, he doesn't try to explain why he does the things that he does. He says, Job, who are you? Who are you to question me? I've reached out my hand over your life and you're whining about where my hand is in relation to you. You don't like the things that are happening and you don't think I have the right to do them. So let me ask you, where were you when all this happened? Show me your great power. Stand up and be a man. Election, it's not just a soteriological thing, not just to do with salvation. Election has everything to do with all of the gospel. It has everything to do with our suffering. I mean, that's the whole point of how can Paul make the promise that God causes all things to work together for our good if God isn't in charge of those things, if He doesn't determine those things and plan them? How can God know that they're going to be for our good if He's not sovereign over them? Abraham would have stayed where he was had God not chosen him. Isaac and Jacob. Job found God is sovereign over even these terrible things that have happened to me. Election. God does what He wants and it's good. Job found that out the hard way, didn't he? Job, God does what He wants. And it's good. And if you'd have been there for just that first little bit there of Job's experience, you might have said, well, how is any of this for good? But we have the benefit of being able to back out and look at the end. We're not trapped in that time, and we're able to see how it all turned out, and we can say, oh, I see, yeah. God did what He wanted, and it turned out to be good. That's the gist of what election is. You see it through, we've mentioned Joseph and his brothers several times lately. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. It doesn't say that what you intended for evil, God intercepted that and ended up using it for good. It says God intended it. God always planned for me to go through these things so that He could save you. God wasn't reacting to what the brothers did. He wasn't hoping that things would turn out differently. From the beginning, from ancient times, He declared this would happen. And so it did. And his brothers ended up doing exactly exactly what they were always going to do. It's kind of a weird little mystery there to that. I mean, how does that all work out? Well, you're a slave to sin. You're broken and depraved, and you voluntarily do wickedness. God is able to work those things out, knowing who you are and what you do, and guarantees that it's for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. He told Israel as a nation in Deuteronomy, He said, "The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for His treasured possession out of all the peoples who were on the face of the earth." Do you think that was secondary importance to them? Was that some ivory tower theology to them? Or was that the core of their experience, the core of their spiritual hope and nature? God has chosen you out of all the peoples of the earth to be His treasured possession. I did not choose the Canaanites to be my treasured possession. Could He have? Could it be said that, well, He didn't choose the Canaanites because they were wicked pagans, but the Israelites, well, they were easier to work with. They were more malleable. Well, that's kind of what Israel started thinking, wasn't it? And He says to them, do not say in your hearts, God's done this because I'm so much better than them. Because you are just as wicked, you are just as stiff-necked, just as sinful, just as rebellious, just as deserving of wrath, and just as undeserving of mercy as anyone else. But we're talking about election. This is, I can do what I want and it's good. I will do what I want and it's good. No one can stop me. The same thing we see when Israel goes into Egypt. And they spend 430 years there in subjection. Did God have the right to do that? Well, He told Abraham, this is what I'm going to do, didn't He? He says, your children are going to go into this land and they're going to be slaves. They're going to be oppressed for 400 years. This wasn't a reaction. Things didn't get out of control for Him. He planned it and announced it before it ever happened. I'm going to cause this to happen. But don't worry, it's for the good of those who love me and are called according to my purpose. All the judges, the fall of Eli, we can just walk right through Israel's history and we can see time after time that everything is in God's hands. That He sovereignly dictates and controls history. The heart of the king is in His hands. The Lord has created everything for a purpose, even the wicked for the day of evil. There's not a single thing, there's not a single person, there's not a single day, nothing that is outside of what He has desired and caused. Tonight we're going to see that explicitly in Samuel's story, in Saul's story, in 1 Samuel, starting in chapter 9. You're going to go to chapter 11, and like I said, I'm going to paraphrase some. I'm going to skip some. I want to get just the main points so we can see how God does this in Saul's life. So in chapter 9, the first thing is that there's a man named Kish. Kish is the father of Saul. And Saul's just a young man. And the donkeys escape. There's an accident, right? That wasn't supposed to happen. The donkeys escaped, and we don't really care about donkeys. But they would have cared. This is a major problem for them. They can't continue at maximum speed, of producing whatever it was they produced. They need those donkeys back. They escaped. And so Kish tells his son, he says, hey, I want you to go and find them. So Saul goes out, and he goes from one place to the next, to the next, to the next. And finally says, we've been to 4 different places, and we hadn't found them yet. Dad's going to start getting worried about me, so we need to head back home. But he's got this servant with him, and the servant says, you know what, there's actually, before we leave, I've got a little bit of money, and there's a prophet in this next town here. We can stop by there, and it's known that whatever he says usually comes true. So how about we go over there and just ask him first? And Saul says, it's a good idea. Let's take that money and let's go over there. How convenient that his servant was with him and had the money. On the way, they met this group of young women who pointed the way. And they said, well, you know what? Actually, he's in that town, but there's a great sacrifice planned today, a big feast. He's supposed to be in charge of it. So they're not going to eat until he gets there. That means that you really, if you want to catch him, you got to hurry because he's about to be busy and you're not going to be able to talk to him. And so they hoof it. They start moving up there trying to find him. And in verse 14, chapter 9, verse 14, they went up to the city and saw Samuel coming up toward them on his way up to the high place. Now the day before Saul, the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed to Samuel, and he said, tomorrow about this time, I'll send to you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have seen my people because their cry has come to me. When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, here is the man of whom I spoke to you. He it is who shall restrain my people. And so here we have this first instance of election, God doing what he wants to do and using it in his own way for good. He plans even the smallest details, doesn't he? The donkey's getting out. I mean, we talk about chance. We use the word chance. And there are different ways you could look at it. I mean, mathematical, okay, well, the odds, the statistics here, the odds of this happening are this. Or things just work the way they work. Mechanically, things happen. And that's why it was time the donkeys got out. But we can see here that this is the way that God was bringing Saul directly to Samuel, isn't it? He knew this was going to happen, and so he goes to Samuel and he says, hey, Samuel, tomorrow you're going to have a visitor. That visitor is the king that you've been looking for. And God makes it so that the servant is unwilling to leave. Saul says, let's go home. And the servant says, no, wait, let's not leave yet. We can still find these donkeys. Here, I've got some money. I'll pay for it. Let's go find this guy. Even the timing with the sacrifice. We're going to see, if you can just glance down to verse 24 and you can see that even all this was prepared. He'd gone to the waiter beforehand and said, hey, set aside some of the meat. I'll tell you why later. And I imagine they get there and the head of the table, the seat is still empty. And they say, well, who's this for? Don't worry about it. God's got that taken care of. And so God has used these things. He goes to Samuel and he says, Samuel, this is what's going to happen. Just get ready. And everything that happens after, all this other stuff, is to prove to both Saul and the people of Israel that this is God's will. And there's nothing they can do to stop it. You remember Saul's his response to all this when the people find out that he's supposed to be the king? Where'd he go? He marched right up to the front and he was glad and happy, right? No, he went and hid in the baggage. And I don't want to be king. Well, God says, I don't care. If I've stretched out my hand for this purpose, who are you to turn it back? No, you can't. Some of the people later, they say, oh, we don't have to follow this guy Samuel. Some worthless fellows don't want to follow him. It doesn't matter. What God wants to have happen will happen. And there's no stopping it. Look at verse 19. Saul goes up to Samuel and they start talking, and Samuel doesn't really have much of a conversation. He just says, look, go up before me to the high place, for today you shall eat with me. And in the morning I'll let you go, and we'll tell you all that's on your mind. As for the donkeys, I know you hadn't asked, but I already know. They were lost 3 days ago. Don't even think about them, for they've been found. And for whom is all that is desirable in Israel? In other words, who's everybody thinking about right now? Everybody wants to know who's the king. Is it not you and your father's house that's on their minds? And Saul answered, am I not a Benjamite from the least of the tribes of Israel? Is not my clan the humblest of all the clans of the tribe? Why have you spoken in this way? He says, look, I don't think I'm really set on being king. I'm not fit for that job. I'm just a humble guy from a humble clan, from a humble tribe. I'm a nobody. It's very unlikely that I'm supposed to be the king. But it doesn't matter. What's unlikely and what's impossible. I mean, what does Jesus say? With man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. If he sets his mind and will to do it, it will come to pass. And so they go to the meal, and in verse 23, Samuel said to the cook, bring the portion I gave you, of which I said to you, put it aside. So he'd already been over there, and he said, look, set this one aside. Nobody knows why, but it doesn't matter. So the cook took up the leg and what was on it and set them before Saul. And Samuel said, see, what was kept is set before you. Eat, because it was kept for you until the hour appointed that you might eat with the guests. This was set aside especially for you. No one else could have possibly eaten it. It wasn't destined for anyone else. It wasn't planned for anyone else to eat this. This was for you to sit at this table as the guest of honor so that you could eat this portion and you'll know that God has chosen you of all the people of Israel to be the king. And so they do, they eat. And they go to sleep. And the next day we get to chapter 10, verse 1. Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies. And this shall be the sign to you that the Lord has anointed you to be prince over his heritage. He gives them three things. Three things are going to happen to you, Saul. Well, why are these things going to happen? Not because God knew that they would happen, but because God has designed for them to happen. It's not by chance, it's by design. This is what's going to happen to you. When you depart from me today, verse 2, you will meet two men by Rachel's tomb. And those two men are going to say to you, the donkeys have been found, and your father is too worried about you now, so go home. Verse 3, then, after you meet those men, 3 men going up to God at Bethel will meet you. One carrying 3 young goats, another carrying 3 loaves of bread, and another carrying a skin of wine. Can't hardly mistake that, can you? You're going to run across these 3 guys. And they'll greet you and give you 2 loaves of bread. Verse 5, after that, you'll meet a group of prophets coming down from the high place with musical instruments. They'll be prophesying. Then the Spirit of the Lord will rush upon you, and you will prophesy with them and be turned into another man. Now when these signs meet you, do what your hand finds to do, for God is with you. Then go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I'm coming to you to offer burnt offerings and to sacrifice peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait until I come to you and show you what you shall do. When he turned his back to leave Samuel, God gave him another heart. And all of these signs came to pass that day. Some difficult stuff in this passage, especially since you know what happens with Samuel and what did God do to his heart. And I don't think the point of the story is to wonder what he means explicitly by God changed his heart. God made him a new man. I think that the point of this is to see how God sovereignly controls everything that happens. Where did Saul get this new heart? Whatever it means, where did it come from? It wasn't anything he did. He's saying, I don't want to be king. I'm not fit for this. When they try to make him king, I don't think I want to do this. I'm going to try to hide. And God says, I'm going to make you king, and I don't need your permission to do it. I'm going to change your heart as my king. You're going to be over my people Israel. We're going to see this change of heart later when there's an attack on some of the Israelites. These Ammonites come up against them. This is chapter 11, and they hold them They besiege the city. And everybody's pretty afraid, but Saul gets angry and he says, let's go and save them. Well, that's the changed heart. Where'd that come from? It came from God. These things are the things God does to make sure that His will is fulfilled. And so everybody, it's the end of that day, they all go home. His uncle says, hey, tell me what he said. And I don't know why, but Saul didn't really want to tell his uncle about it. He said, he told me about the donkeys, and that was it. He left out the whole part about being made king. Maybe he wasn't sure it was going to happen, or maybe he knew his uncle would try to take advantage of him, whatever it was. He didn't say anything, but it didn't matter because it wasn't long before Samuel comes back into the story and he tells everybody, hey, everybody gather up. And so everybody comes together. And he reminded them that, this is at the end of chapter 10, around verse 19, he says, you've rejected God. This is your new king. Now, therefore, present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands. And then he started to select them. He says, let's have everybody from Benjamin come forward. And so, you have all these tribes there together. And here comes the tribe of Benjamin. And then he says, all right, let's get it down to this family here, this particular clan. And then he says, now we're going to get it down to one guy. And it's Saul. And in verse 21, it says, when they sought him, he could not be found. Verse 22, so they inquired again of the Lord, is there a man still to come? And the Lord said, behold, he's hidden himself in the baggage. And they ran and took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upwards. No matter what he did, he couldn't resist. So Samuel reminded him of the rights and duties of the kingship. He told him what to expect. And then he sent everybody home. Verse 26. Saul also went to his home at Gibeah, and with him went men of valor, whose hearts God had touched. Now, I just want you to think about this. We said at the beginning that basically the simple definition of election is that God does what He wants and it's good. Could God have touched the hearts of every person there and made them all accept Saul? Made them all receive him as king? Sure, why not? He changed Saul's heart. He touched these men's hearts. But some worthless fellows said, how can this man save us? And they despised him and brought him no present, but he held his peace. Regardless of who's rejected him, God has made it. He's touched enough hearts to accomplish His will. He will do what He wants to do. And what He does is good. I'll show you the point. We'll prove the point here in chapter 11. Some Israelites, like I said, they were attacked by the Ammonites. The Ammonites, basically Canaanites, people who lived in the area. Chapter 11, last half of verse 1. The Israelites say, make a treaty with us and we'll serve you. So basically they've got the city surrounded. There's no getting out. There's no defense. And they say, look, let's come to terms. You tell us what you want to let us live and we'll serve you. But Nahash, the Ammonite, said to them, here's what we're going to do. On this condition, I'll make a treaty with you. All of you gouge out your right eyes and bring disgrace on Israel. I can make all of you gouge out your own eyes. That's how you can live if you'll do that. Well, he's pretty proud of himself and he's pretty convinced and pretty certain he's going to be able to hold him in that position. And so the elders of the city said, give us 7 days that we may send messengers through all the territory of Israel. The only thing I can think of this would make sense is this guy knows he's going to lose some of his soldiers in a battle if he presses the siege. And so they say, look, in 7 days you won't have to worry about it. We'll just give up. Okay. If no one comes to save us, we'll give up to you. So when the messengers, verse 4, came to Gibeah of Saul, they reported the matter in the ears of the people, and all the people wept aloud. This is their hearts. They wept. And behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen, and he said, what's wrong with the people that they're weeping? So they told him the news, and the Spirit of God rushed upon him when he heard these words, and his anger was greatly kindled. In verse 7, he took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hand of messengers, saying, "Whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen." Gives them a visual picture. This is his heart now. He's so concerned for Israel and so bent on defending Israel. He kills those oxen. He says, this is what's going to happen for everyone if you don't come out and fight. Then the dread of the Lord fell upon the people. Was that by chance, you think? And they came out as one man. When they mustered together, the people of Israel, there were 300,000. And the men of Judah, there were 30,000. And they said to the messengers who had come, "Thus shall you say to the men of that city, tomorrow by this time the sun is hot, you shall have salvation." Tomorrow morning. When the messengers came and told the men of the city, they were glad. Therefore they said, "Tomorrow we'll give ourselves up to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you." And the next day Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. Then the people said to Samuel, "Who is it that said, Shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel." At this early point in his life, before he has he becomes so arrogant, he's able to see and confess that this salvation is because of God. And because of that, look, let God deal with them. God has worked this salvation for us. Don't even touch them. Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and there renew the kingdom." So they all went there and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. They sacrificed peace offerings. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So this story, chapters 9 through 11, we see how it starts out with Israel saying, well, God, what are you going to do? And God says, I've got everything lined up, from the lost donkeys to the sacrifice that's going to be offered. I've got the bed that night for Saul all lined up. I've got the prophet in place. He's already got the oil. He's going to put it on Saul's head. He's going to make him the king. And there's going to be some backlash. There's going to be some doubt. There's going to be some backpedaling. But none of that's going to matter, because it's all headed to this final victory over those Ammonites. It's all mine. It's all my plan from start to finish. I'm going to give you this king, and he's going to save you the way that you will be saved. Do you see Christ in this? And do you see the parallel between that Old Testament story and the New Testament? Where God there's Christ at the very end, and he's saying, not my will, but your will be done. He trusted in this fact that God does what he wants and it's good. He knew that God had called him to be king. He knew that God had called him to be the deliverer of Israel. And so he entrusted himself to him. And what about for us? I think about several verses in the New Testament. I'm just going to give you the references, but I want you to listen to them. In John chapter 15, verse 16, Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, "You did not choose me, but what? I chose you and appointed you that what? You should go and bear much fruit, and that your fruit should abide." Look, y'all were sinners. There is none righteous. There is none who seeks God. That includes all 12 of the disciples. You weren't looking for me, but I came to you. And guess what? Most of Israel rejected me. Isn't that what it says at the beginning of John? I mean, can you imagine John writing that letter? And he says the world didn't know him and his own rejected him. And you know what? I would have rejected him. I did not choose him. He chose me. He appointed me. Just like he appointed Saul. He appointed me that I should bear much fruit and that my fruit should stick around, that it should abide. Later, when the apostles are preaching to the Gentiles in the book of Acts, it says, when the Gentiles heard the gospel, this is Acts 13:48, they began rejoicing and glorifying the word of the Lord, and as many as were appointed to eternal life believed. I know people have a hard time with this doctrine of election. They question the fairness of God. They question a lot of stuff about it. But what can you say in response to that? As many as were chosen, appointed, put in the position, the same way that, did God give everyone the chance to be king, or did God give that position only to Saul? There he is sitting at the table. Saul, this was set aside for you. No, it wasn't set aside for me. I can't have it. He can't have it either. It's just for you. We get here in the New Testament, he says, as many of them as were appointed. God had taken this thing and set it aside for them and from ancient times. Well, how about this one? Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4. God chose us in him when? Before the foundation of the world, that we should be what? Holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us for adoption to himself. This is what it means to be called the sons of God, right? To those who believed in him, he gave them power to be called the sons of God, to become sons of God. So it's to those who believed, right? But God chose us in him before the foundation of the world. Before you believed, God chose you in him, that you should be holy and blameless. He predestined, he planned for that adoption. Through Jesus Christ. Why? According to what? The purpose of his will. According to the purpose of his will. That takes us back to what we read in Isaiah. This is my hand reached out. Who's going to turn it back? When I say I'm going to do something, there's no one who can stop me. And it's crazy because not even Saul could stop himself from being made king. If God wanted it to happen, it's going to happen. You can fight it as much as you want. You can run off and hide. It's going to happen. Joseph could have struggled as much as he wanted. Fight against his brothers, but it was going to happen. He predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ according to the purpose of his will. How do you think Paul felt about that in the New Testament? He's going down that road, Damascus. He's looking for whoever he can capture and kill. And then he's blind, lying there in the mud. And this voice saying, "What are you doing? You think that you can stop me. You think you've raised yourself up, trying to prevent me, the nation's rage, the people's plot in vain. Saul, that's you right now. But you can't win. Because I have predestined you for adoption to myself as my son through Jesus Christ according to the purpose of my will." And it made such an impression on Paul that when he wrote his second letter to the Thessalonians, this is chapter 2, verse 13, he says, "We ought always give thanks to God for you, brothers, beloved by the Lord, because God chose you as the first fruits to be saved through sanctification by the Spirit and belief in the truth. To this he called you through our gospel, so that you may obtain the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ." He says, folks, I'm so thankful for you because God has chosen you, and look at the difference it's made. And what's our response to this? What's our thoughts about this? I mean, is this a secondary theology for us? I'll say that this is the foundation of everything that we believe. What you believe about God's sovereignty and the way that God causes things to happen for His own will totally dictates. Well, it comes from what you believe about Him, and it dictates what you believe about Him. And who we are. Really tells you what the gospel is and what to expect from the gospel. It tells you what a church is. We are the elect, are we not? And some people struggle with it. And you know what? It's not easy to understand all the time. I mean, there are some things that are difficult. But don't make the mistake of saying, well, because these things don't seem fair to me, or because I don't understand all the fine points of these things, I'm just going to reject the whole thing. You cannot deny the fact that it is real, the fact that it is there. No matter how it makes you feel, and no matter what conflicts you might see that are caused from it, you cannot deny the fact that it's there. Any more than Abraham could deny the fact that God has called me out of all the people. Any more that Israel would have ever even tried to fight against the idea that God has chosen us among all the people. But if you see it for what it is, you realize it's the only way to guarantee salvation to fallen men. It's the only way that God could say, I guarantee it's for your good. How do you know it's for my good? Because I know how to plan. I know the end from the beginning. I know the choices you're going to make. I know the things you're going to do. I know what's going to happen to you. I guarantee it's for your good. It's the only way that salvation can be guaranteed to fallen men, because we are desperately wicked and beyond cure. Our hearts are broken. There's none righteous. This explains to us why we can say salvation is not by works, is it? It can't be by works. It's by faith. By faith in the God who has called us. And some people, they hear this stuff and they say, well, man, that's just pride, you know. Well, let me just ask you this. Where would I find any kind of pride in this? The reason that Israel found pride in who they were as a nation is because they said to themselves in their hearts, it's because I'm better than other people. And God said, don't do that. Is there pride in election? Well, you can boast about God. You can boast in the cross. But you have to realize this had absolutely nothing to do with me. Abraham would have stayed on that side of the river if it hadn't been for God. Joseph would have killed his brothers right then and there if it hadn't been for God. He died for me, not while I was seeking him, but because he was seeking me, while we were yet sinners. That is grace. That is the only reason that we have come to believe in him. Where is there room for pride in that? I didn't deserve it. I didn't even want it. I was like Saul, hiding the baggage. The great thing about it is that after he has done this, you remember the verse? It says, it is God who works in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. So why do you do the good things that you do? Because God is working in you. He's giving you the will to do those things and the power to do those things. When we think about it like this, man, election, it can't result in failure, can it? And the first thing I think of when I say that is, well, what about Saul? I mean, we know what happened to him. He was elect too, wasn't he? Elected to be the king, yes. What happened from his kingship? Led us to David. Who'd David lead us to? David led us to Christ, didn't he? All things work together for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Saul's appointment as king was for my good. It was for your good. If you love him and are called according to his purpose, and in the same way, everything that happens to you is for your good. It is controlled by God. He knows about it. So here's what I want you to do with this. I want you to worship him for it. I want you to be confident in these things. It's all for his glory. And he who promised is faithful. Father, we thank you for this truth, and we thank you for this example. May we rest in who you are. May we have more than just religion. May we trust you that you can do what you want, and it's good. In your name we pray. Amen.